Hey everybody, welcome back to Jericho Road, and we would love to have your questions in this new year. If you have any questions for me, you can send these to rwebster@st-lukes.com, rwebster@st-lukes.com, and we will incorporate your questions into future episodes. Another thing we're trying to do this year is we're calling this year Chapter 3. We're moving from the world of Jesus into the teachings of Jesus, so we're here at Chapter 3, and this is Episode 2, and we're talking about living water. Last week, I think we all agreed that the Bible can be hard to read sometimes. It can be hard to read because we're separated by time, of course, but we're also separated by culture. And one of the ways that we're separated culturally is we don't understand their need for water. They thought about water all the time. In the world of the Bible, water is something precious and it's rare. We don't think about water because we've got water. But now that I've said it, you can begin to see where water plays a key role in stories, and especially the Gospel of John. Now, we also learned last week, or agreed last week, that the Gospel of John is just different. There are 4 Gospels. The first 3 Gospels are pretty much the same. They're the same because Matthew and Luke have almost all of Mark in them. So they're called the Synoptic Gospels, which means written with the same view or seen with the same eye. And when I tell you this, you'll remember, we all know this already. These 3 Gospels have the same shape. They're basically a contrast between Jesus' Galilean ministry and then his traveling to Jerusalem to be surrounded by his enemies and to die. It's a contrast between his rock star days around the Sea of Galilee, calling disciples, if you will, feeding 5,000 people, stilling a storm, lots of miracles, all that great stuff. And then he goes down to Jerusalem for the Passover and becomes the Passover lamb, the last sacrifice. It's a clear journey, it's a clear contrast, and it's good theology because our communion words are Passover words. John's gospel is different. John's gospel is not linear like the first 3. It doesn't really have one trajectory. It doesn't start with Christmas. It rather starts at the beginning of time. It fills in gaps, if you will, that the other 3 didn't. I've got a theory. I think that John's gospel was written later. We do believe that. It was written later for the purpose of rounding the story out, much like Godfather Part 2. Right? Godfather. John's gospel presumes that you know about Vito Corleone. No. John's gospel presumes that you know about the stories of Jesus that we have in the first 3, so that you can begin to see a different dimension of the memory of Jesus, of what Jesus did. In particular, John's gospel remembers the other feasts besides Passover. So there were 3 times that God's people were required to go to Jerusalem to worship. 3 times. There was the Passover, and then you had Pentecost, which happened 50 days later, and then you had Sukkot, which happened in the fall. It was a harvest festival, and let's just say Sukkot was the fun one. Sukkot was fun because, the work was finished. Everything had been brought in, everything had been gathered, and so people would come to celebrate how God had taken care of them, just like God took care of the Israelites as they traveled through the desert from Egypt into the Promised Land. Just as Moses and God gave them the law and fed them with manna and quails, they would celebrate the fact that God had given them the bounty for the new year. Lots and lots and lots of fun. And at some point, the harvest festival would shift over to a petition for, you guessed it, water. Water. It was very, very important to pray for water. It was very important to ask God for the new gift of water, because without the winter rains, the crops won't grow and they will die. So this is a world where every drop of water is counted. And Sukkot, in addition to all the wild celebrating of the good work that had been done, also anticipated that God would take care of them again, in particular with water. Now, the prophet Hezekiah loved Sukkot. And he loved it to the point that he spoke God's words about it. And he said that one day, this is Zechariah chapter 14, if you want to look it up. Zechariah 14, the prophet said that one day the Messiah would return. And at the end of time, there would be enough water for everybody. See, they're always thinking about water, right? They won't have to worry about water anymore, because God will give them everything they need. Water, living water is what he called it, that fresh water. Living water would flow out of the temple in every direction, and the Messiah would be there. And then even better than that, all the nations of the world even the ones who had been at war with Israel, will come and worship the one God at Sukkot. That's what he said. Now, that was his dream. In John chapter 7, I find it remarkable, if you know about water, and you know about Sukkot, and you know about Jesus at the festivals, you see that in John chapter 7, on the last day of the festival, the great day, we're told that Jesus stood among everyone, and he said, I am living water. John's gospel is about that. It's about water. Again and again and again, Jesus is living water. John chapter 2, Jesus turns water into wine, but it's water for purification. It's worship water, it's living water that he turns into wine for a wedding reception. In John chapter 4, a Samaritan woman, is laboring at a well at the noon of the day because she's got no friends and she's got a loose reputation, and Jesus reaches out to her in grace and in love and offers her living water, which means that Sukkot is not only happening in Jerusalem, but it's busting out everywhere, and it's busting out for everyone, even in enemy territory. See how it's starting to make sense now? John chapter 5, man by the pool of Bethesda, water, which was healing water, but he can't reach it because everybody blocks him out of the way. Jesus becomes the living water that heals the man there. So now, the point I'm trying to make is that if we can live in their world and think about water the way that they did, or think about water as a vehicle for worship and for healing, John's gospel is about water. Everywhere. Sukkot is busting out all over the place. And today, I want to tell you another story about water. The photo that I'm showing you is a model of the Pool of Siloam. It's about a 1/10 scale model of the city of Jerusalem, and it fascinates me. This model is at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, and I can look at this thing for hours and hours and hours and hours. And what you're looking at is that you can see the pool at the bottom. I've circled it in blue. And then to the right, you see the original city of David. So this is the original capital city, if you will, of King David and then the kings of Judah. Got a little analogy that'll help you get your mind around all this. When my daughter was little, she was off at camp. She made me a Bible cover. Oh my gosh, that's like every minister's dream, is to have a Bible cover made by his daughter, right? And on it, so she made me a Bible cover in camp, and I've still got it, and it says on the cover, just made of cloth, and it has marker on it. But it says, most famous preacher in Crestline. Right. Okay, that's a low bar. Crestline is about, it's like saying most famous preacher in the parking lot. I mean, that's it, right? There's no other preacher around here hardly. So that's not really famous. Well, the funny thing when you see the city of David is you begin to realize that King David, mighty King David of psalm and in verse and in song, was just the king of a little bitty place. It was never any better than the days of King David. And so in order to understand how important Siloam would be and to get ourselves minds around this geographically, I need to remind you of your timeline. Now, in past episodes of the podcast, we've all made a timeline of the Old Testament. And if you don't have one, you can take a piece of paper and write this down, because I need to give you a couple of dates so that the rest of the story of Siloam will make sense. 1,000 years before Jesus' birth. So that's a long time ago, 3,000 years ago. 1,000 years, that's King David in that little bitty city of David that you just saw in the Israel model. Okay, that's King David. And he presided over a nation of 12 tribes comprising roughly the geographic area of modern Israel today, which is to say that mighty King David ruled in Crestline over a country the size of Alabama. But there you go. He still changed world history and changed our lives forever, but that's it. It's just not a big place. And so there you go. It was never any better than King David 1,000 years before. Then if you want to write down another date, you could write down roughly, these are rough dates, but it'll get your mind around it, 900 BC. By the time you get to King David's grandson, the nation of the kingdom of Israel has split into two countries. You've got Israel in the north with 10 tribes, and you've got 2 tribes in the south making the kingdom of Judah. This is why the Old Testament can be a little hard to read, because you're saying, wait a minute, I thought they said Israel. What's with the Judah? Why are there 2 kings at the same time? Why are they fighting each other? Wait a minute, where's the capital? I thought it was in Jerusalem. They're saying it's in Samaria. It's because you're talking about 2 places. And so Israel was always bigger, the 10-tribe country. It was always bigger, always had more money, It had more trade relations, I think, with its neighbors, but it was never quite as stable because it didn't have a stable capital city like Judah to the south. Jerusalem was that stabilizing factor, and of course, also if you look at God's promise, Jerusalem would be God's city, and the line of David would be God's line. I mean, there's the theological importance of that, but also just from a historic and an economic, if you will, point of view, Israel just never really, it teetered a bit, and in 722 it was completely wiped off the map by the superpower at that time, which was the Syrian army. Now, very soon, the Assyrian army would turn its sights on Judah as well. It was bound to happen. Judah got into some alliances, seeking to secure its place in a power vacuum, but a king named Sennacherib decided to besiege Judah and would end it once and for all. So what you're looking at now is a little bitty capital city, the city of David, that's in big trouble. My pally Don says that any Old Testament city needed to have three things in order to survive. It's got to have defense, so it's got to have a wall or be on a hill. Jerusalem had that. It's a hilltop city, fairly easy to defend that way. It needs to be near roads for trade. Jerusalem had that, and it needs to have water. Okay, Jerusalem had a big problem. Now, have I made the case already that water is really important? They think about it all the time. Well, in the case of Jerusalem, they had water. It's called the Gihon Spring, but it sat in a valley outside the city walls. You can't have water outside the city walls. If the Assyrians surround the city and they get to your water, you're dead. Look at any story that you know about a siege, whether it's Vicksburg or Stalingrad or any siege story. Once the water's gone, you're in big trouble. Now, prior inhabitants of Jerusalem tried to fix this problem by putting ramparts and a wall around the Gihon Spring, and that worked okay, except, hey, remember the importance of water? They had water for themselves, but water would continue to flow out down the hill so that the Assyrian army could have water too, which means that the siege would go on indefinitely, which means they had a big problem. Fortunately, this tiny little place, right, the city of David, had a good king at the time, a good leader, a good builder, a guy with good ideas, and his name is Hezekiah. Now, in the book of 2 Chronicles, we're told a little bit about their predicament with water. Now, I know many of you have made New Year's resolutions, and you want to dig into Scripture and start reading the Bible a little more. I'm going to give you permission. So Rich said you don't have to read 1st and 2nd Chronicles unless you just want to. But there is some important history in here. And the year is 701 BC, and King Sennacherib of Assyria has got the kingdom of Judah in their crosshairs, and this is what we read. 2 Chronicles chapter 32, beginning with the 2nd verse. It goes like this. When Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib had come and intended to fight against Jerusalem, he planned with his officers and his warriors to stop the flow of the springs that were outside the city, and they helped him. And a great many people were gathered, and they stopped all the springs in the wadi that flowed through the land, saying, "Why should the Assyrian kings come and find water in abundance?" Water. Okay, here's the story of the pool of Siloam. Hezekiah built a tunnel to keep all the water inside the city walls and to save them from the siege. I've got a picture of the tunnel from our pilgrims walking down there. It's really tight. If you've ever been to a cave like DeSoto Caverns or Ruby Falls, it sort of feels like this, but it's entirely man-made. It's only head high. I've got a funny story I'll tell you. When Rebecca watches this, she'll kill me. One of our associate clergy, Rebecca, was with me a couple years ago in a group, and you can actually walk through the tunnel today, which is what we've done, this tunnel that takes the water from the Gihon Spring and down to the pool of Siloam. And before we were sort of go down this narrow little staircase, she said, "Rich, I'm very, very claustrophobic. I don't like tunnels. Is this a tunnel?" And I thought about it because we had a big group, and I didn't know how to get her down to the Pool of Siloam. You see, Pool of Siloam is about 375 feet down the hill. It's a steep grade, and so I didn't really know how to take her not down the tunnel and meet them. So I just lied. I said, "It's just a museum down there. It's not really anything." And so about halfway through the tunnel, I heard this, "It's a tunnel! It's a tunnel!" it's a tunnel. And I said, I'm so sorry. Anyway, it's head high and it's really narrow and it zigzags. And so my pally Don says that there's a very, very good theory that this was by design. They only had a small amount of time to build this tunnel and to withstand the siege, right, to keep the water inside the city walls. And so if they had to meet each other. They couldn't just dig one way and dig down. They had to have two groups. But how do you get the groups to meet? And if you dig in a straight line, you might go past each other. And they can't hear each other through the rocks, although that was a theory for a long time. So the idea was that they just simply zigged and zagged and zigged and zagged and zigged and zagged until they met. And you can go to that spot where they met today. And it's really, really poignant because when you realize that you're the place where the diggers, the tunnelers met, the engineers met in the bottom, right beneath the city of David, enclosing the water source inside the city walls, saving Judah from the Assyrians, you realize that had they not achieved this engineering feat, the story would end. Look, that's why I'm telling you the story. I mean, the tunnel in itself is interesting, but without the tunnel, they don't make it. We all know about the later Babylonian exile, right? That happened 600 years before Jesus. That was another story. The Assyrians were not the Babylonians. They would wipe you out forever. Israel disappeared, never to be found again. We don't really fully understand what happened to them, and we wouldn't know what would happen to the tiny little city of David as it was surrounded by the Assyrian army. What we do know is that the tunnel saved them. The tunnel is important because it kept the story going. I like the analogy of, remember the beginning of Forrest Gump with the little feather that float around, and then the feather would float, and then at different parts of the story, the feather would just kind of float in. And God's promise to Abraham under the night sky when he would look up at the stars, and he promised him that all these stars would be his children, and this would be his legacy forever. And through Jesus Christ, we get to be those stars. That story's like a feather. It's delicate, and it gets right up on the edge of just ending. And here at 701 BC, which we learn in the book of 2 Chronicles, they almost didn't make it, which brings us back to the pool of Siloam. I'll show you the photograph of the model again. So I've got the model circled in blue, and there was a long alleyway between the city of David off to the left, if you will, and some other buildings that they could wash in Siloam, and they would walk up to the Temple Mount for worship. And so Siloam was important for at least two reasons. One, it was their entryway to worship. Two, it was a monument to their greatness. It was a monument to their greatness. It was a monument to the greatness of Hezekiah who saved them. It was a monument to their ingenuity. The pool of Siloam would remind them that they could do anything. It reminded them that they were once a mighty nation that could withstand Assyria. Okay, it was a point of national pride, and God knew it as well. So God would have a final word about Siloam. Okay, the photograph I want to show you now is the limestone steps of Siloam. It's just a little close-up. There's really not a whole lot that's been uncovered there, and it's really not that pretty a location yet. It's in a neighborhood, and they have to be very careful how they dig around it. There's not a whole lot that has been uncovered, but I like to look at these stones because I play a game that I call a get. A get is when you can look at something or you can touch something that you can find in the Bible. I find it thrilling to either be in a place or to touch something that people looked at and wrote about thousands of years ago in their search for God. And in this way, Siloam is sort of the ultimate get. You think about all the pilgrims who would wash here and then ascend the Temple Mount for worship, including Jesus, year after year after year, festival after festival after festival. All the people of the Bible, all the faithful people you could think of who have walked through and washed and gone up to worship again and again and again. And in many ways, Siloam is the ultimate get. It's for this reason that God had to say something to them to remind them. Now, I will sometimes quote prophets, and then I'll sometimes quote kings. And I'll sometimes quote history, and then I'll sometimes refer back to a dream. Prophets are very, very important in Scripture. The prophets that we have in our Hebrew Scriptures are important for this reason. When God's people asked for kings, God said, that's fine. I'll give you a king. I'll let you have a king. I'll let you be a nation. But I'm also going to give you prophets to speak my perspective, my truth. Israel asked for kings. God gave them prophets. Prophets are important because prophets remind us of God's priorities. Prophets remind us of God's hopes for us, God's dreams for us. And in the time of Hezekiah, there was a royal observer, a prophet by the name of Micah. Now, Micah's very, very important because Micah would take this mighty monument of Siloam and recast it with God's perspective. Now, why is this important? Well, in the sermon that I preached last week, I talked about success. And for those of you who know St. Luke's, who know the neighborhood around St. Luke's, we're a very successful place. I mean, that's something that's just honest, and you don't even have to brag. You could just look around at nice cars and nice houses and successful businesses to know that success is a little bit of a standard in the village around this church. However, there's a danger to success because what happens is that with success, happiness becomes a destination as opposed to a journey. It becomes something to acquire rather than a gift. What happens is success sort of skews things. I mean, we start to think that our success becomes something that we did, and it becomes our reward for our achievements, so that our prizes are supposed to be the things that made us happy, right? A new boat, or a new car, or whatever toys that we may think that we need, and so we fill this hole that can never be filled inside of us with success or with things that we've achieved or acquired or we've earned, so that we could be happiness, and it's a never-ending treadmill, and we need saving. That story is eternal. That's the same story of the people of the Bible, and it's the same story of the people living in 2021. And so Micah, looking at this averted siege, looking at mighty King Hezekiah, looking at this mighty accomplishment of the tunnel, the pool of Siloam, looking at everything, he wants to remind God's people of God's priorities. And so in Micah chapter 6, now, you may not want to read 2 Chronicles, but I do want you to read the prophet Micah. In Micah chapter 6, beginning with the 6th verse, we first have a contrast between what a king would call success and what God calls success, and it goes like this. Micah 6, verse 6. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? Now here's God's priority. He has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. Justice, kindness, humility. These point to the truth of God's dream for us. Happiness is a daily journey. Happiness is a humble walk with God. Tunnels are nice. Pools of Siloam are nice. Success is nice. Humility is the key. Which brings us back to the Gospel of John and another story about water that has to do with the pool of Siloam. It's John chapter 9. Jesus and his disciples are walking along, and they see a man who's been blind from birth. You can read the whole story, but in the second chapter, the disciples ask a question that was obvious for them in their day. What caused this man to be blind, they ask in effect. Was it his sin or his parents' sin? And it makes Jesus really sad, but that's the kind of cause and effect question that they would ask in those days, and we would ask in our time just in a little different way. It was very common in those days to ascribe illness to sin, and we need to be very careful when we read this not to do what they would be tempted to do, which is to ascribe some sort of defective physicality to our own misdoings, right? In other words, we can't victimize people who are suffering from any kind of lack of what we have physically. We just can't do it. You see, I want to be so careful with this to say that it seems cruel to ask, oh, did he sin? Why is he blind? But we do cause and effect questions in a different way. We might say this: God never puts more on our plate than we can handle. Right? We just need to know that when we see something tragic like blindness or something that's just shouldn't be God's will, an early death, a global pandemic, if you will, then we just want to say, well, it must be God's plan. But that's not really biblical thinking, that sort of cause and effect thought. Really, if you want to think like a Bible person, we need to remember that the people who wrote it, the Hebrews, didn't think in this linear way. They thought in what we like to call block logic. I'll give you an example. A linear logic or linear statement would be like this: A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. Everything adds up. God never puts more on our plate than we can handle. It must have been God's will. God wants to teach me something, so he's taken away my sight. This kind of thing, right? Block logic is very different. Block logic has gaps and it has mystery, because in the gap it's God, and it's God's knowledge alone. The writers of the Bible wrote the very first word of the Bible. In the beginning was one word in Hebrew, Bereshit, which is the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which means that the sages would say you never can start with the first letter of the alphabet, because that knowledge is reserved for God. We can never fully know on this side of the veil what's going on. So block logic works like this. We learned about it in our podcast on Exodus. Pharaoh hardened his heart. God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And then you would ask the writer of Exodus, well, which one is it? I mean, did God harden Pharaoh's heart? Did Pharaoh harden his own heart? And the Hebrews would say, yes. Yes. And in the middle, there's a mystery. In the middle, we find God. And so John remembers Jesus looking at his friends, and with that own historic, continuing block logic of Scripture, Jesus says, neither, guys. Nobody sinned, and just so that I could show you that God's works will be revealed. Let me do something. I'll read it to you. It's John chapter 9, beginning with the 3rd verse. Jesus answered, neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I'm in the world, I'm the light of the world. And when he said this, he spat on the ground and made mud with the saliva and spread the mud on the man's eyes, saying to him, go, wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. And then he went and he washed and came back able to see. Here's what I think John is remembering Jesus saying. When John sees blindness, when Jesus sees blindness, when Jesus sees hurt, when Jesus sees something that's less than God's intention for his creation, God's heart is the first to break. When we're hurting, God's hurting. There's no punishment for our sin in this way. We live in an imperfect world because we live in a free world. We live in a world where things go awry, but in time, God will lead us home. God will get us through it. God promises guidance, and God promises strength. And there at the mighty pool of Siloam, you see 3 elements to this man's healing: mud, spit, water. Not an incantation, not a speech, not a lightning bolt from the sky. What heals the man? Mud, spit, water. Justice, kindness, humility. You see, Micah's dream was coming true at the pool of Siloam, just as Zechariah's dream was coming true at the Feast of Sukkot. Sukkot's breaking out all over the place. God is back in living color. They've got everything that they need in abundance. They always did. But now Jesus came to show them how it all works. Mud, spit, water. Justice, kindness, humility. What the story teaches us is that God meets us in the little ways and in the everyday. God meets us in a dream. God meets us in a sunrise. God meets us in the eyes of children. God meets us in being at the right place at the right time. God meets us in protection. God meets us in happiness. If we can see this, then we will see that God is with us every moment of our journey, meeting our needs in every way. And we too can be deep down happy. Well, with all these stories about water, I'll leave us with a question for today. How do you define walking humbly with your God? That's your question. How do you define walking humbly with your God? Friends, I've got another chapter next week on water in John's Gospel. I look forward to seeing you, and thank you so much for listening to Jericho Road. Amen.